Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a few more minutes to let people join us, and then we'll start officially, perhaps a little bit late. Okay, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to start. We still have people joining us, but I think we will start the introductions, and by the time we get to the main event, we should have a full complement. So my name is Conor McGarrigle. I'm a lecturer in fine art here at the School of Art and Design in TU Dublin, and we're based here in Dublin. So I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of TU Dublin, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and on behalf of the FAST45 consortium partners. So I'm going to start with a quick word on the format today. We have two speakers, a keynote by Dr. Stéphane Vincent-Lancon, and a response from Dr. Orla McDonough, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the talk. You can put your questions into the chat, but we will ask people to come on camera and speak their questions directly if possible. If that's not possible, that's also okay. The session is being recorded, and the session is also being live streamed on Vimeo. And you'll find the links for all these on the FAST45 website, which is fast45.eu. So before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to start with a little bit of information on the FAST45 project. So it is an Erasmus Plus Knowledge Alliance, a 3-year project funded by the European Commission. It's led by Lucas School of Arts in Brussels, and we have 13 partners representing higher arts education and industry stakeholders, and they're based in Belgium, Estonia, France, Germany, Ireland, Finland, Spain, and in Switzerland. So it's a very pan-European project. So the project employs a future study approach to imagine, to map, and to shape a higher arts education landscape where participation and research, education in the arts play a crucial role, not only within the arts sector, but in society as a whole. At TU Dublin, we coordinate the learning platform. And again, that's on the website fast45.eu. And in its first phase, we've hosted a series of talks from leading international experts that have critically examined and unpacked the conceptual underpinnings and the role of learning platforms in education. And this has been set against the history of educational technology. And the insights from these conversations will then inform the next phase of the project. And these talks have complemented a parallel set of activities by our partners throughout the consortium, and they've included participating workshops, a data mapping of the arts sector based on a vast number of interviews with stakeholders, a summer school, and a series of ongoing Future Lab workshops throughout the consortium. Again, more information on the activities of the project are on the website fast45.eu. So today we are very pleased to present the 6th and the final talk in the series, which looks to the future of educational technology and platforms. So 2021, in the wake of COVID-19 and the global school shutdowns, the unprecedented shift to online teaching, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, released their Digital Education Outlook called Pushing the Frontiers of Education with AI, Blockchain and Robots. And this was a major policy document that examined the potential for the emerging technologies of AI and machine learning, blockchain and robots to transform education in the same way that they are transforming society. And it's a very important report, and it outlines the state of the art and details the challenges and the opportunities for education from a policy perspective that these advances present. So I'm very happy to welcome the editor of that report, Dr. Stéphane Vincent-Lancoin, as our speaker today. He's a senior analyst and deputy head of division at the Center of Education Research and Innovation at the OECD. His research includes fostering creativity and critical thinking in education, the impact of arts education, schooling during the pandemic, and he leads the OECD work on digitalization in education. He's a Marie Curie Fellow, a Fulbright New Century Scholar, and holds a doctorate in economics and a master's in philosophy. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Stéphane, and thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be with you. And so I'm going to share my screen and what we have been doing as part of this work on digitalization. In fact, it all started before COVID, and before we knew that, there would be this kind of stress test for all education systems. It was more in the wake of all the talks on, the replacement of human beings by robots in society, so it's when you had AI on all the covers of the magazines. And so it's really to try to understand what would be the implication of learning analytics, AI, the Internet of Things, robots, blockchain, etc. So all this buzzword that we've been hearing on education. So we have started to look at what the frontiers are. So what is it that all this technology can help education to do? A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, everything exists. It is something that happens somewhere, usually not at scale. Some of them are actually at a larger scale than others, but it's basically, things that are coming and, and for which education systems had to basically get prepared. So you can actually have, the book is out, but we had a big event and with actually many of the researchers, experts who wrote the chapters presenting what they've been doing, and it's all on replay. If you're interested in some specific aspects of it, you can actually go there. What I'm going to do now is to kind of overview of all that, try to think a little bit about what this may have in terms of implication for the future, and try to relate it a little bit to what I assume you're interested in, so the arts education. So two different things that we've been looking at. One is really how AI and all these smart technologies can actually change the management of schools and systems. When I say school, I mean any kind of education institution. It can be a higher education institution as well as something else. There are not big differences across the different levels of education. And then I will turn into what could change more in the classroom, so really for teaching and learning. So there are a lot of applications of all these technologies for system management. So one of the backbone is really the student information system. So it's really how for at the system level, you know exactly what's going on, how people can actually go from one institution to the other, for example, how you can really track them. And a lot of these processes of system management are increasingly being digitized. The way we communicate with parents, with students, admission systems in some countries, how the allocation of public resources is actually made, how the facilities, sometimes the campuses, are increasingly managed, and actually that's perhaps it's even more important, when we have a sustainable development goals, you know, and an agenda of sustainability. So, for example, the management of energy, of the flows of students in a campus, etc. All these things can actually now be much more managed thanks to digital tools. I'm just going to focus on a few of them. One is actually how early warning systems and the use typically students' information system to try to predict which students are at risk of dropping out. You know, that's one of the big problems in many OECD countries. And so basically, you know, the question is how to try to predict that in an important way so that, you know, we keep people educated and in the education system as long as possible when it is at least relevant. But another thing which is interesting with those systems is that it allows you, and I believe that's really one of the very important things to keep in mind with digitalization and the use of data, is really that they allow us to think a bit differently about the system. And so, for example, colleagues who've been working on early warning systems, Burroughs and Trout in the US, have shown actually that, you know, there are 3 different types of profiles of dropouts. One that they've called the jaded, which is basically the one that we have in mind when you think about, you know, the people dropping out. So students who don't like school and who are disengaged and who have, you know, low grades. And so, you know, interestingly, they only represent a minority of those. You know, the big majority is what they call the quiet dropouts. Who are students who actually like school, who have grades that actually increase, but too slowly, and that's part of the problem, and so they will end up also dropping out. And you have almost 10% of students who are very involved, have strong, a good academic performance, but who drop out for a variety of reasons, the most common one being a lack of credits, you know, so they realize that at the end of their high school, that's usually when it happens, that they don't have the right number of credits, and so then they don't want to continue. So what's very important in that is that the implications are very different depending on the profile that you have, and so that it really helps us to think a bit differently about, with evidence, about what is actually happening to different students. Another example of that, for example, is the use of longitudinal information systems. So, for example, in the United States, again, you know, when you have community colleges, they tend, you know, there are these open door colleges who try to educate as many people as possible. And, you know, they are usually considered to be a model of 2 years, and you can do it either part-time or full-time. And one of the things that longitudinal information systems have shown is that, in fact, this idea that you have a full-time and part-time students doesn't really work in the case of community colleges, because people switch very, very often, and then after a few a semester, you don't know anymore who is a part-time and a full-time. And just this realization has made people engage into a reform. You know, it's basically the idea that you have too many different options that are offered to students, and which actually lead to the very low completion rates that are observed in higher education in these community colleges, because in many cases there are less than 10% of completion rates in many of these colleges. Another thing that at the system level, you know, this technology will allow us to do is really to rethink assessment and exams, and actually use simulations and games to do that, and make, you know, so that you can actually test the skills rather than just the knowledge about different things. We have, even for the usual types of exam, you know, there is an increasing reliability of machine rating for many of the essays. And one of the interesting things which relates to the early warning system that I presented, you know, is this idea of predicting may at some point make exams redundant, possibly, you know, if we don't see them as a kind of right or the only equitable way of doing things, so that there is a really political aspects behind it. But basically, you could as well see how based on the past grade and profile of the students, where they would fit better, what are the different options that they would have, etc. And so that could be a different way of thinking about this. The last point I wanted to highlight on that is the fact that credentials can also become digitized and are actually increasingly being digitized. So that's which digitalization has really allowed to have a much more granular way of assessing, so we don't just have the degrees, which are still very useful, but you can have all these badges that are the micro credentials that can actually be associated to the acquisition of more very specific skills. That's something that you cannot have track of in the analogic world. You really need to have a place where you can stack all these different things. And even if it is not the case, you have a lot. One of the big changes, and blockchain is really one of the technology that allows for that, is to be able to have verifiable degrees, but which will be in the hands of the degree holders rather than in the institution. So that's really one of the big differences, that it shifts actually the kind of ownership and responsibility from the institution to the degree owners. Even so, obviously the institutions will still have to ground them and make sure that they do it in a safe and secure way. So what will happen now if we think of AI in the classroom? So the first thing, and probably the one that is already the most common, is really about personalization. One of the oldest and the most mature technology in education are intelligent tutoring systems, which actually allow students to get exercise, to practice, and which will actually provide them with personalized content, the next step that they have to do. So the way they work is basically to usually detect, what the students are doing. So sometimes with a test, sometimes in other ways, to diagnose what they should be actually learning. Should they be doing something bad, for example, continue to work on some specific idea, or should they move on to something which is more difficult? And that they can do now at different things at the step level. So it's really how you go from one very small task to the next, more, in terms of changing the concept, but within the same concept. So, for example, how you're moving from, let's say, subtraction to well, addition to subtractions or something like that, or at the curriculum level, you know how to count, so now you can move on to something which is actually a bit different. All these systems tend to actually be an aid for teachers, and what they do is that even so there is some level of automation in them, they actually also provide information to teachers on what they could do next, should they continue to give these students individual work, peer work, should they actually give them some kind of tutoring. And usually, in fact, even so there is a level of automation, they actually ask for help from the teachers. So, we are not yet at the level where you can do everything just by using these different systems. Another thing that they do, usually most of the systems were mainly looking at the knowledge that the students had, to assess what were the academic level before they would give them some more information. Increasingly, this is being broadened, and you can actually look at metacognitive elements, the level of engagement, the style of learning, etc. And there is a new branch of it which really focuses on engagement and how to keep students engaged. There are a lot of different ways of doing that. One that is highlighted on this slide is actually how you can do look with age tracking, make sure that the students are still doing the task, or on the right-hand side, you can actually understand how the students deal with some text, etc. So it gives a lot of new information or feedback to the teachers. something which is a bit more probably experimental, but that is very interesting, in the way it works, is classroom analytics. So instead of, it is a bit the same idea as an intelligent tutoring system, but instead of having one student as the input, you have the whole classroom. And so basically, what these systems do is that they give information about what's going on for a collective group or in a specific space. And they tend to do it in two different ways, either in real time, and then they provide information to the teacher in different ways, or they do it after the class and more as a way for teachers to actually reflect on what they have been doing, and which can be seen as a form of professional learning. So the way that it works for that, or the natural evolution of it would be to really have a class full of cameras, sensors, and so that you have to think of the classroom as a kind of a smart classroom or a computer, in fact. And with a lot of displays, so you have people have experimented. It can be a dashboard on the walls, on glasses, but a dashboard can be the classroom itself in some cases as well. And so here you can have example, for example, of what is called ambient dashboards. You can see on the tables, there is this kind of lamps. Some are red, some are green. And so they kind of give, that's a lantern devices, which give the tutors, information about where, which students they should actually go and help, etc. Or here you have another one, which actually shows how you can use these things to regulate teamwork. So here you can see the number of lights and dots show how long different people have spoken. And of course, so here in that particular case, you can see that the lady on the bottom right has spoken most, perhaps because she was the one who presented what the task was about, etc. But there is a kind of feedback that you can get for some of those different activities. Another one, which this time is more, I would say, an example of professional learning here, is very simple things such as the location of the teachers and how much time the teachers spend, with different groups. So here you can see, for example, on the right-hand side, that you have the big circle show that the teacher has spent a lot of time, most likely, at her desk, but then that most of the time she has spent actually time with the students on the left-hand side of the room and not so much on the one on the right-hand side. So there might be reasons for that or not. And so, that gives you a kind of information about things that you would do. Another one, for example, another application of it is how you can, it's how much time, who speaks in the classroom, and there have been interesting studies showing, for example, that usually teachers underestimate very much how long they talk compared to their students, even when they want to do dialogic teaching or active learning. So that's really one way to get information and to reflect on what, as a teacher, we may have been doing. A big thing that technology can do in the classroom is really to make them more inclusive, especially for students with special needs. And here, you have a lot of applications for that work for visually impaired students or hearing impaired, and seeing that we have in our smartphones, usually, text to speech, speak to text, automatic captioning, which are, becoming more and more developed, but also a new interesting special tools to address some specific needs, like dyslexia, dysgraphia, etc. And even actually conditions which are usually, behavioral and more difficult, such as, autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, you have a lot of new types of ways to address that using technology. And so here on the right-hand side, actually, it's a tool which try to train an autistic student to gain interpersonal skills. And one of the interesting things actually in that, in that particular example, which is called ECHO, is something that colleagues in the UK have actually designed, is that we don't see that person on that picture, but there is actually a human being on the side, because the system is not good enough to actually detect what should the next step be. And what happened during the research on that is that there is actually a new link between the person who is actually making choosing all these different exercises for the student and the student, so that in fact it's very important that you have actually a human being in the loop, as is often the case with all the different systems. Last example I wanted to take is, robots. So robots are usually now quite common, but used for the teaching and learning of coding or computational thinking. But and here usually speaking, it's about programming them, so it's, but what's new and probably that is, and already exists, and is there, but too expensive to be mainstream. But it's really the use of social robots, which have been actually programmed to do a lot of different things. They can actually be instructors, or they can sometimes, be a tutor, for a small group, or sometimes just peer students. So that would be the student actually would teach the robot to do it. And the studies that show, many studies show that actually they are almost as good as human beings, but only when doing a very narrowly defined task. So for example, for foreign language learning, they tend to be pretty good, and sometimes with a good teacher aid, for example, and they may actually have much better accent than some of the teachers that can be otherwise be interviewed. And the last thing, which actually was probably interesting, especially in the COVID time, are telepresence robots, which are in fact some kind of a robot with a screen, and then the screen can become a student who is not in the room, or a teacher who is not in the room, and who can actually teach from remotely from somewhere and activate a lot of different things. So here, that's not a robot that is a social robot. It is just a telepresence robot that make human beings being part of a group and allow them to do a lot of things from a distance. So that's really, some of, gives you an idea of, what is already possible thanks to, the most advanced technology. Well, what we've seen during the COVID crisis is basically that we're far from there, and if we had then, it would have been possible to perhaps, to get help to create learning resources, to have personalized instructions. This would be very helpful for students with special needs, and actually one of the things that in some cases he did was actually also to take exams remotely with proctoring systems, which are these systems that actually make sure that you're not cheating when you're doing something by yourself in your room. But in fact, there was very little AI in many of the solutions that we've seen deployed in most countries. In fact, what we've seen is that all the technologies were put to use, and usually in interesting ways. That was a comeback of TV education, radio education, things like mobile phones, WhatsApp, texting, etc., were also used. And many countries have put in place multimodal approaches, meaning that they had these learning platforms, but they also had a lot of different things to support learners. We've seen as well that there was the digital infrastructure was not really ready, and so that all these developments will require a lot of new investments and new thinking from countries to actually become more prevalent and more mainstream in countries. So what are some of these challenges that we see? So Before I go into them, one of the things that you can see across all the different types of solutions that we have presented in our digital education outlook. First is that all the models that we have are based on hybrid human AI models. So there are a lot of discussion about whether robots or AI is going to replace human beings. Are they going to make teachers redundant? Well, it's perhaps one day, I doubt it, but what is sure is that currently none of the solutions are based on that assumption, and they all actually, or almost all, assume that there is actually a teacher, so that there is always a human being, a teacher in the loop, or an administrator that actually makes the decisions at the end of the day. There is very few automated decision-making in education, or it is not one that has any high stake. Most of those applications are still experimental, so there are few that are already used at scale. I would say personalized learning is the one. It's mainly used in language learning or in mathematics. Early warning system in some countries, actually in the United States mainly, and then blockchain. We have a lot of pockets, of people using art for credentialing, which is a very specific use and rather limited one as well when it comes to education. One thing to keep in mind is that many of these things are not fully developed. There are very varying degrees of algorithmic accuracy. So sometimes it can be pretty good, but sometimes it's very not so good. So if you think of an early warning system, there are some of them were tested, and some of them just predict with 1 chance out of 2, if someone is going to drop out. So if your probability to predict that is 50%, then I can do it myself. That's part. I don't even need to know anything. Some of them do a much better job on that, but we have to remain pretty lucid about how good they are at this stage. And what's important as well is that very few have actually, there is not that much evidence whether they're effective or not, which is actually also something which is difficult to evaluate. And the last thing is that in many cases, while this has been one of the old thing about technology, that sometimes being available doesn't mean that it is actually being used. And sometimes the reason why it is not used is because it's not good enough or it's not really useful. And so very important and to make sure that the solutions are both useful and cost effective rather than just possible. And that's particularly true, for example, for students with special needs. We have things sometimes which are really great that work, but they are so expensive that no school is going to be able to use it. So that thinking about the affordability is something which is a very important dimension. So if I, kind of summarize some of these challenges, so one is really to make them useful, have solutions with stakeholders, especially when you keep in mind that many of the solutions are developed for other sectors and then deployed in the education sector. Work with stakeholders on, those benefits so that they get used, which is what happens usually in research, but not necessarily in the more industrial production of these tools. There is a question of the effectiveness. Sometimes, someone has to verify that these solutions do what they say they do. Are they accurate in what they do, and is it a problem if they are not? Do they improve the outcomes? And so that's really one of the difficulties. There is a question of the equity, and that has something to do with the digital divide, the affordability. So let's, how can we have cheap solutions? So for that, using existing platforms such as a mobile phone, for example, is one of the way to do it. But it's also to have interoperability that allows schools or institutions to actually change system and don't get locked in with one particular solution, because then it just becomes too expensive. We have to restart all the time. So the sustainability of the solution and the affordability is something which is very important and related to open standards, the interoperability that allows people to switch easily when they want to from one solution to another. Increasingly, there are new discussions that are happening. So one is fairness, the question of algorithmic bias and how, in fact, some solutions could replicate biases because of the data that they use, that's the technique of machine learning, or sometimes the choices in the design of the algorithm. And so it's very important to verify before, but also after, look at what are the implications of these things for different groups of students. And that's a very important one. Transparency is another challenge, especially because a lot of those techniques are pretty opaque. So one way to deal with that, is to have open data and open algorithm, as a movement, and allow some people who will be experts, you and I, or certainly I, will not be able to verify any of that, but be able to see what the algorithm is actually doing to the extent it is possible. So explain how it works, but we have to keep in mind that in some cases, if we want to have powerful algorithm, well, they have to be opaque because human beings just don't know exactly how they work, once they are started. And so when you speak with some of the developers, they can tell you what type of algorithm they use, but they cannot tell you exactly what the algorithm is doing once it is doing his process. And we have to keep in mind the political nature of many of that. There are many solutions that we take for granted, like, for example, exams. We believe that this is a natural, normal thing to do, and we forget that, in fact, they are the result of a social discussion, and that there is a level of social acceptance because, the stakeholders have agreed that this was something okay to do, etc. And in many cases, if you jump to a technological solution without thinking about that, it may actually create some level of backlash and not work. And that was typically the case in England, even so it was not AI, but just regular algorithms. When during the COVID, they decided to use this method for the university entrance process. Finally, we have the question of data protection. So it's regulated in most countries, and in Europe, it's even strongly regulated with GDPR. What's important to keep in mind for that is that there is zero risk policy. It's not possible, if you want to do something. So we have to find the right balance on that, make sure that privacy is well protected, that, some uses are not possible, that there is some level of security of the solutions. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that if we want to have the benefits, we have to take a little bit of risk as well. And perhaps that at the end of the day, many of the educational data are not so, I would say, risky, that's their users don't have that many risky implications in many cases. So where could we go from there? So here, I'm just suggesting 3 future scenarios, and it would be interesting to hear what you think about that. One is basically that, we could just get back to where we were and continue kind of slow digitalization with, an adoption that remains relatively limited in the classroom, but probably that we continue to accelerate a bit for the administrative aspects, for the system management, the school management, etc. So that the social way of schooling doesn't really change, and schooling or higher education, as well as what teachers do, parents or students, that remains pretty similar to what we know now. Well, digitalization will continue outside of education, and it's very likely that the edtech market will also continue to grow, but that will be mainly for the non-formal education market, so the consumer market, and which will target, the tutoring users, non-formal users, and you will still have a lot of apps on how to draw, how to, learn to play the guitar or whatever. And here, there would still be a policy interest in digital literacy and competencies mainly, but a lot of investments in digital education infrastructure will actually just follow the pre-COVID trends and not go much further than that. Second possible scenario, which actually relates much more to what I've presented to you, is basically that we turn into smart schools and universities, and so that you have a lot of sensors of information everywhere, and so you have classroom and learning analytics, which would be pervasive, everywhere, with smart classroom and campuses providing real-time information to teachers, principals, and administrators. So, in fact, what's interesting is that the school could, or the classroom could remain very much the same way it looks now, because it would be equipped with a lot of things that is not necessarily visible. Think of your car, your car looks more or less, if you have one, I don't, it looks very much like it used to be 20 years ago or 40 years ago, except that now it's a big computer with a lot of sensors that, tell you whether you're fastened your seatbelt, will tell you if you have a risk to have a collision with another car, etc., etc. So that you have a lot of new things. However, it looks more or less the same as what it used to be, but you have much more feedback than before. So here that would be more or less the same, where we could do all these kind of things. And of course, that would mean that there would be much more involvement of the edtech industry with schools and universities, which in itself would actually also make all these things more affordable for everyone. And so here, many of the policies would invest in, the infrastructure, smart campuses, and regulation, to ensure that the technology is effective and also provides value for money for everyone. And the last scenario, the third one, which is a continuation of the second one in some ways, that, you would have more or less following the changes in society, there would also be changes in the way that we think about school. Perhaps that would be a bit less true for higher education, because higher education to some extent already works a bit like that. But basically that, we could imagine teachers still working some time, students staying at home, also when they want, even so they could still go to school if they wanted. But basically that, there would be a use of digital tools, which would be assumed both in class and out of class, and so, the schools would focus much more on authentic tasks and projects which would be supervised by teachers. And, we would think much more closely about the time that students spend together and with the teachers, which would be very much for collective learning or collective projects, or so the social dimension of the learning would really be what would be done, especially when people are together in class. And so here for that, the edtech solutions would actually continue, but here what would be different mainly from the second scenario is that, the learning environments will have to be rethought, because it would no longer be the same as before. And also the digital infrastructure and the way that it is accessed, it would have to be not just as at school, where we assume that it's going on, but also what's going on when people are at home or outside of the school. So for the arts, you can imagine that, there are different ways of thinking. So I would say scenario one, is basically that there will be, but very slowly, more use of digital tools in arts education. So, and here it's mainly thinking of arts education in primary and secondary, where, you could do much more digital composition, use tools such as GarageBand or equivalent to make students do music, for real. In visual arts, the tablets, 3D printers, etc., would become a bit more, but it wouldn't change dramatically from what people are currently doing. That would be more with the idea of developing the digital skills of the students. In the second scenario, we could imagine that over time, there would be the development of intelligent tutoring systems for the arts. I'm not aware of any right now, but perhaps actually you know about some of them. And there would, be feedback for the arts teachers on what they're doing, to whom they talk in the studio, who needs more support, or, perhaps if it's about dance, for example, much more ways to monitor what people have been doing, etc. So there would be actually, all these feedback loops that would make it easier for teachers to actually follow what the students are doing. And then scenario 3 would probably actually also change much more the types of tasks. So more collaborative project work, probably more also individual, different mix of individualized and collective teaching and tutoring, and much more use of digital means, which actually in some ways is already what is happening at the higher education level. So that could be much more of a change in primary and secondary education. So the issues with all the different scenarios, one, obviously the equity of access, so in the scenario 1, it can be seen as equitable because we have a limited access for all, but of course there are huge variations at home. In the second scenario, you would have also great access in school for all, but variations at home, and actually the third scenario would have to equalize a bit more what's happening between home and school, where you would have more or less the same kind of tools available. In terms of the fairness, you have there is a question, you have it wouldn't change much compared to scenario 1 compared to current practices, where you would have actually a variety of resources available to different students, but it wouldn't change. The second scenario would allow for better personalization and for the correction of biases, because you would actually have feedback on what you do, that you would use more intelligent tutoring system, etc. And so that would possibly help. And the third scenario could be more disruptive, with more personalized pathways, which would make standard exam more difficult, but which would allow people to. So with that, we would have to think about different ways actually of rewarding and giving degrees to people. We could imagine that there would be different ways of rewarding people. It could be the learning motivation rather than the achievement, for example, and much more equal learning resources at home. And then in terms of the effectiveness, we probably in scenario 1, for sure, we'd have more efficient administrative processes, even so it wouldn't change much in terms of the learning. Second scenario, hopefully better learning outcomes, because we would have, better teacher professional learning, in fact. But of course, that's the primality that it's just something which is expensive. And same for the scenario 3, which would not just be better performance, but really more personalization of the learning outcomes to each individual, but also very expensive infrastructure. So that's, some of the possible challenges related to all the different scenarios. So to conclude, well, digitalization has a lot of opportunities to offer to transform and to improve education, but of course it can go in different directions, and of course, depending on how the technology is used. And when we talk a lot, and that's perhaps one side comment, when it's not just used by the technology developers, but also used by the human beings that are doing education. Think of, for example, early warning system. There are two different ways of using them. One is to make sure that the students who are at risk of dropping out do not drop out. Another one is actually to not take the burden and just expel the students so that they go to another school, which will have to deal with the problem, etc. And what happens when this happens, and this is one phenomenon that has been observed, what happens is basically that the students do drop out even more quickly than perhaps if they stayed in their initial school. Digital transformation requires social acceptance. I've already mentioned that, and that's a very and of a lot of different things, you know, and so there is a work that has to be done, a social work that has to be done for these changes to actually take place. There is a cost to it, you know, the infrastructure, and that's one that in the initial days of technology was a bit forgotten, you know, people had the idea that, well, it's going to cost us computers, but in fact, the problem of computers is that you have to change them all the time, and that will be true for all these new tools that we are also talking about here. So, you know, if you think of it in terms of cost-benefit analysis, you know, we would really have to monitor what the benefits of all these tools would be, and in some cases, you know, the rational option maybe, even if, you know, some of these things could be done, not to do them may actually be the most, the best possible solution. But in any event, you know, digitalization will have an impact on education, on the education sector. You know, it's not, question is what impact and how we can actually really benefit from these things. And for that, you know, I think that international collaboration and research and the work that you're doing, for example, is really going to help us. Last thing, and that's really more advertisement, just for you to know, you know, that we've been doing some work on arts education. So Art for Art's Sake is a book on the impacts of arts education on non-art skills, a kind of meta-analysis that we've done sometime. But I'd also like to flag, you know, this project on creativity and critical thinking. We have developed some rubrics, some examples of lesson plans. So here currently, you know, this report is about primary and secondary education, and we're currently doing exactly the same in higher education. And so in about 1 year time, there will also be a report on that will display the findings of the work we've been doing with 24 higher education institutions from 13 countries on how to equip students with creativity and critical thinking at the same time as subject knowledge, both content and procedural knowledge in a variety of domains, including the arts. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your response and reactions to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for that fascinating, challenging, and thought-provoking talk. So what we're going to do now, before we go to the questions, is we're going to go over to Orla McDonough, who is going to respond to your talk. And Orla is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at TU Dublin. But in addition to her duties as a Dean, she's a concert pianist, and she has studied in the Juilliard, the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University, and she has no less than 3 degrees in piano performance. And she also finds the time to be an active performer and a recording artist, and is the founding member of the McDonough Sisters Duo and the Wilds Trio. So an interesting combination of skills and abilities. So I'll turn over to you now, Orla.
Thank you, Connor, and thank you very much, Stefan, for the fascinating presentation with so much of what is current really in our world. I suppose in response, there are maybe 4 or 5 different areas that I will briefly talk about before we open up the questions to the group, the wider group. Certainly colleagues on the call will be very aware from all of the universities and institutions you're joining us from that universities are definitely already looking at AI, robotics and blockchain in terms of technologies that will support a more sustainable operational practice. And so in terms of your universities, for example, in the States that are using facial recognition to identify usage within sustainable usage of buildings, computer labs, spaces, etc. There are clearly in different areas of the globe with different legislation, there are clearly issues with some of that. And I think our philosophers and our sociologists, our humanists, and indeed our artists need to be very present and engaged in the discussion around these kinds of usages. Besides facial recognition technology, of course, in some universities, they're using digital buttons to identify student movement patterns in cafeterias and things like this. And you can see where that might be very helpful in terms of planning forward for usage of space. And it, to some degree, that reflects back a little, Stefan, to what you were talking about in terms of information around participation in meetings, how much people engage or discuss, where a teacher might become more aware of how they use physical space within a classroom and the impact that that has. Those are some of the learning technologies that you spoke about. And you mentioned student support services engaging with, for example, retention and students having access to information. So some of the things that certainly we are looking and discussing as a university are items to do with how chatbots can get information to students rather than students running into a scenario where they can't get a hold of somebody physically. And the positive aspects that can actually result from an increased level of engagement when students have an immediate answer, as opposed to maybe operating more traditionally with having to show up to an office or having to operate within office hours. So there are a lot of things like that that I think we're already seeing universities and institutions using. In terms of COVID, of course, we have all experienced 2 years of a very sudden immersion into the reality of hybrid working and hybrid learning, and the impact in terms of how we actually operate our classrooms, the impact on access to technology that students are experiencing, and indeed that various institutions are experiencing. You mentioned the resource implications of really the wider accessibility of the future of what we're heading into with technology, let alone what is happening now. And we're already seeing that. There are questions, as I see, are being raised in the chat around the impact on quality assurance in certain countries, which is very true. We're already, however, for many years dealing with the use of various technological platforms to identify, let's say, plagiarism. And so there are things that we have been familiar with for a long time within higher arts and higher education more generally. But the pace of change with what is becoming available to us is, I think, one of the real challenges that we have. And it has an impact on the pedagogies that we use as higher education professionals. Many of us, particularly within the arts world, emerge from a master apprentice tradition. And that is quite a significant cultural shift for a lot of staff within higher education arts delivery. Who are not necessarily perhaps as actively engaged with, let's say, the emerging technologies, the technologies that we already have in relation particularly to AI and blockchain and robotics. So I think that's an interesting question for us in higher education. How do we culturally shift our current selves so that we can actually be responsive and proactive in relation to the changes that technology are bringing forward for us. We're seeing this in some cases with, let's say, the use of virtual learning environments, many of which are very, very helpful for a lot of disciplines, but which can also provide challenges for certain arts disciplines, because universities or institutions might often choose a one-size-fits-all approach and go for a resource solution that may not necessarily provide the extra aspects of what a virtual learning environment might require if you're dealing, let's say, with high-level media arts or creative and performing arts schools, for example, what they may need. So this is a particular access issue that even within organizations we may be experiencing. Certainly, I think we're seeing the positive impact in best practice examples in terms of student engagement, retention. We're exploring the new types of assessments. Within the arts education sector, of course, we all know we've been exploring new types of assessments for a long time. So one of the challenges I think we'll need to address as we work through this project, and I'm so delighted that FAST45 is having these conversations and exploring the kind of challenges and the possibilities that this technology provides us, is if you look, for example, at some of the resistance in higher education originally to the introduction of professional doctorates. Our organizations for years have been very used to the traditional PhD. But if you look at arts institutions which are introducing level 10 qualifications that are appropriately vivaed and examined with different outputs to perhaps what is an old book or thesis type output, we have an indication perhaps of some of the level of challenge that it will take to actually more broadly educate our university and higher education community about how these advanced technologies can help support a more diverse spectrum of assessments and then the quality assurance behind them. So I think that's an interesting piece that we need to consider. Specifically, I suppose, in relation to the arts piece, you've mentioned access, which is a huge issue, particularly not just for students coming into arts higher education programs, but also indeed for professional artists throughout their lives. So I think that's a question that we need to examine. Certainly the impact on artistic careers we've already seen in very positive terms. Blockchain technology helping independent artists to actually bypass systems, either whether they are banking or agent or major in, let's say, take music, for example, the kind of stranglehold that a lot of the record companies may have had on the independent production of the art. So that particular piece has had a hugely positive impact. But then there are also the other sides. So in relation to music specifically, Spotify has had a monstrous effect on the production of CDs, for example, and what traditionally in the last 100 years or so might have been the main mechanism for a performing musician to actually make money. So what's interesting is Berkeley and MIT coming together to try to address this and kind of counteract some of the emergencies that have resulted in that particular world from the impact of some of these technologies. On the very positive side, of course, there are hugely exciting things happening from a collaborative standpoint, and you've referenced that in your talk today. Projects where we are able to access communities that are more distantly related to us. I think for higher education, we have an opportunity as perhaps artistic educational leaders to impact all levels of education by using that collaborative approach that you've already identified. In TU Dublin, we're doing that with projects in Sherkin Island. We're doing that with partners all across Europe. And I think those opportunities are very exciting as we move forward. So that connection and that access piece has a positive, not just necessarily the concerns we might have about sort of equality, diversity, inclusion in terms of access to the physical technology to allow students to engage. I think really in terms of higher education, one of our challenges, and particularly as arts educators, is going to be the challenge of keeping pace with the development of the technologies that are available to us. And then for our institutions to provide supports to upskill our staff members in order to be able to make the best use out of the emerging technologies. So there's a resourcing piece in terms of accessing that on a more institutional scale, but then there's also the people piece around making sure that our colleagues, ourselves, are given the opportunity to actually realize where these technologies can be highly useful in the emergence and the evolution of their pedagogical practice. And then in terms of the arts in particular, I think there's a really interesting question. And we know in all of the art forms that we deal with layers of creativity. And this might be slightly controversial, perhaps, for me to say. But, you know, we see this in the use of technology as over centuries. There are different layers of creativity and some philosophical questions around what does it truly mean to be original? I think are things that we're really going to have to examine as artist educators as we move forward. So I look forward to those kinds of discussions emerging in the next number of years through this project. I might finally, I suppose, mention just one or two things clearly there's already technologies that have revolutionized the arts. Digital image editing, crowdfunding, streaming, 3D printing, video mapping, augmented realities. So these are things that we're already experimenting well with and getting more used to. And certainly there are advantages, as I've mentioned, to that. But I think also the challenges, I suppose, the questions for us in higher education that I might leave us with as a response, perhaps. And I'd be curious, Stefan, about your thoughts on this, and obviously the thoughts of the wider group that are joining us today, is particularly when you consider that master apprentice model that was around for centuries, and the switch from that into the use of these enhanced tools and where we see that going. I think that's a particular conversation piece culturally that is very important to us in higher arts education. I think we need to ask ourselves questions around what is it that we actually need this technology for, which we can't already solve. And I'll give you a good example from my own background. As a piano teacher, you can be a fabulous piano teacher, have lots of different ideas, but eventually a child has to go home and practice every day in between your one lesson on a Tuesday to the next lesson on a Tuesday. So a question that could be very interesting to explore in that particular area is, how can, for example, a robot help a small person who has not developed the patience or the maturity to be able to practice regularly every day? How can they help and reinforce and make that aspect of things fun in a chance to improve their skills? So widening that question, I think we need, as a cohort of individuals within higher arts education, to ask ourselves, what can AI actually actively come in and help us solve and quality enhance in terms of what we're delivering? Maybe a second question for us, particularly as artists, is what is unique to the human interaction piece when it comes to creativity and arts education? And I think that's a very, very important question for us to not just be reactive to, but actually to be out there pushing in terms of a frontier discussion on that, which is, of course, what Fast 45 is doing. And then I think the last question I would pose that I think is important for us to look at is, where is that difference between mimicry and perhaps the most original artistic creativity? And how does the engagement with the very experimental and exciting tools that are available to us in AI, and robotics and blockchain technology assist us in defining those areas? And where does it perhaps challenge us? So these are the thoughts, I suppose, that are floating through my head, having listened to a sense the update of what is available currently, but also looking at it from the standpoint of essentially an artist educator. So I hope that is something that will help inspire a little bit of conversation. But I suppose in the first instance, Stefan, I don't know if you have any thoughts or reactions in any of that. And Connor, I might pass it over to you because technically I'm not moderating this. I'm just responding.
Okay, thank you very much, Orla. That was, again, a really detailed and well thought through response. So I'll turn it over to you, Stefan, if you want to give a response to that. And then we have many questions in the chat, so I want to work through those as well, because I know there's people waiting to come on and talk.
So perhaps let me say that playing the piano myself, I agree that you, if you don't practice, you will have a lot of difficulties to, and AI will not help you with that for sure. But you're absolutely right that it's well possible that a social robot can actually, as a friend, or give feedback and reinforce, give support to that. There are a few things, that nonetheless I find, these tools change music education a lot, because in fact, you don't need to have someone play an instrument anymore so in fact, what you can do, a lot of music education before higher education is, most people learn music or art outside of school, the truth is. But now you can actually use these tools to make people understand what music is about without them actually having to know how to play an instrument, you know, and they can compose and they can actually listen to what they are doing. And so it changes very much what is possible to teach, you know, in a classroom, etc. And that makes really a very big difference. On the question of originality, you're right that there is a big challenge here, you know, and because even so we say that AI is not creative, you know, the kind of thing that we learn to do, like reproducing what other people have done, you know, and AI can do that, or will be able to do it, you know. So and so there is, you're absolutely right. There is what an AI cannot do right now is to do something which is truly original. Another thing, for example, you know, there is a lot, and there were these exhibitions of visual arts created by AI, for example. But when I speak to people, you know, everyone tells me, oh yes, you know, an AI can create a lot of different things, you know, but the truth is that at the end of the day, it is a human being who picks what is the one that is actually worth showing, you know, and out of thousands of attempts of it. And so that's pretty here that there is still a very big superiority of human beings. Even so, it is well possible that an AI will be able to compose something that sounds like Brahms much better than, you know, many human beings. No, big question for us is whether we'll be interested in listening to that, you know, because why are we still interested in actually, you know, we tend to be more interested in what our fellow human beings are doing than what machine can do, you know, and that's perhaps something that has more to do with society than to the quality of the performance, if you want, or the perfection of it, because it's not perfection that we're interested in when we're interested in the arts. So I think that's a very challenging and last comment on the master apprentice aspect. I'm not sure that the technology will challenge that necessarily. You know, it's just another way could be a way to reinforce these. If you think of, you know, in other domains, it may be actually a way to make these things more possible, you know, so that you, instead of learning things which are, you know, in the art, it's a bit different because you do things, you know, you train people to perform or to produce what they are supposed to do, and that the assessment is basically, is the output that you've had, whether it's a performance or a product, good enough in relation to, you know, the standards of the profession. In many other domains, it is not the case, you know, that what you do when you do a paper and pencil exam, you know, well, there are not many professions where that's what you have to do, you know, that's, and so here that will actually allow to do something which is much more authentic in many cases, and perhaps much closer to this master-apprentice relationship. And I think it's really beneficial to learning, in fact, if you can actually do that.
I don't know if Connor just, oh no, he's there.
Yeah, so I think what I'd like to do now is turn it over to the audience. We have many questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people if they would please turn on their camera and ask the question directly. And I'm going to go through them basically in order that they have come through. So we'll be very egalitarian in that. So first, there's a question from Suzanne Schumacher. Suzanne, if you'd like to come live and ask your question.
Yes, do you hear me? So thank you very much for showing us your research, and thank you to Ola for this response and contextualizing this in the field of arts education. So you showed us a lot the perspective of institutions, of teachers, of management, of the management and making more efficient the education practices, processes. And I would like to shift the perspective maybe a little bit more to the students in this environment. So did you do any research on their perspective? How would students use these technologies presented by you in order to improve their learning experiences and their abilities in learning? So that would be my suggestion. Let's turn the perspective and take a little bit the perspective of the students. That seems to be, for me, in the discussion a little bit the objectives of your investigations. Thank you very much.
So I think it depends on the technology. Some of them are really for teachers and others are for students and teachers. So what I can say, you know, that as I've said, you know, it's a lot of relatively experimental kind of research, and of course all the students consented to be part of that research. Whether they will like to be monitored constantly, well, I'm not sure. You know, I would personally not like it so much. You know, and so there are some ways to actually deal with that. One that was used was to delete, in fact, all the information about, you know, that the censors had taken, so that in fact you could only see what was the result, but you couldn't go back to, you know, all this type of information. In terms of the use of the students themselves, you know, it is interesting for students because it sometimes allows them to do things in a different way. You know? So an intelligent tutoring system, that's typically something that has an interface with the student, and where basically, you know, it's something that helps them to practice different things, give them feedback, and make sure that they, you know, they make progress, you know, and identifies where they do have what kind of consistent mistake they're making, etc., so that they can actually correct them. So usually speaking, it is rather beneficial and for them. Even so, one of the difficulties that they can get bored, you know, which is why there are also all these new systems that have been developed to keep them on task and engage in it, and in a lot of different ways. You know, which is one of why, you know, all this research had been initially developed. If you think of the use, you know, again, for example, for foreign language learning, one thing is, you know, the possibility to have to use simulations to interact with people who are very far away and, you know, speak the language. And one of the big problems, for example, in foreign language teaching in many cases is that it seems to be many people experience it as if it was a dead language, you know, that because they don't really relate to, you know, people actually speaking this language, the culture in which they are, etc. And a lot of the uses of these technologies is actually to make it much more present, pertinent, authentic, and engaging, you know. And so now at the end of the day, you know, I wouldn't say that the technology is what matters, you know, the technology is just a tool in the hands of a teacher, a learner, and at the end of the day, it's really what they do with it, which will actually make a difference. So I can imagine that some students will hate it, others will love it, and it will very much depend on what learning scenario was provided to them, you know. So if you have something that, and so very difficult to answer, you know, in terms of what I would expect students to think about it. Now, if you want to know the information that we have post-COVID, for example, I can tell you that students prefer to be in presence and don't, you know, they don't like to have too much technology. Whether this will remain the case is a question, especially because there is increasingly a kind of divorce between their life outside of education and what they do in an education institution.
I'd like to call on the next question. There is a question from Dermot O'Callaghan. I think this may also be a question for Orla as well. Dermot, do you want to
Thanks,
are.
Connor. I presume sound is getting through. Stefan, I was very interested in what your comments around personalized learning, and it works very well in preschool, it works very well in primary school, and then we force our learners in secondary school and university into a very standardized experience, probably mostly driven by the examinations that we force on top of them at the end. And yet the digitalization gives us much greater capacity to personalize the learning for individuals to meet their needs. And I would suggest that the students, using your car analogy over a generation, the students in the last generation have a greater need to have involvement in their learning experience at this stage. Is it time for the universities to let go of this need for uniformity in the learning experience and assessment and just open it up greater to broaden those experiences? Are we ready for that yet?
I don't know if we're ready, but I think that that would be a very good thing to do, you know. Probably, in fact, in arts education, there is a bit more of that, you know, because people are asked to do something which is more personal and meets their actually, you know. But I agree with you that, you know, in many other domains, this is something that should be also encouraged in many ways, and which is difficult to do. So I think it's not just a question of well, part of it is exams, you're absolutely right, you know, and assessment, and we want to have something which is fair. And the way that we've thought about it is that everyone has to do the same thing so that we are sure that, you know, the merit of those who do better at that particular one will allow them to move forward or in some different directions. But I think the other one is really how teachers also deal with their knowledge and their, you know, and how they and the students, because when you start to personalize more, that also means that as a teacher, you may go in direction that where you're not so competent. And where you have to accept that, in fact, you know, you just have to follow what, you know, where the students go and accept that, in fact, you don't have all the answers for that. And that's really one, so that's, you're right, that's what Let Go is also about, you know, not just for the institutions, but let go of some aspects of the role, you know, or the traditional role of teachers.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
Orla, I was wondering, would you like to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I would agree very much that I think in arts education in particular, we've been pushing that boundary because of the different types of assessments that we are involved with outside. And not to say that we don't have traditional exams, because there are, of course, examples of that, but the diversity of assessment practice and therefore the diversity of quality enhancement procedures that are attached to those practices is already quite broad. I don't see any issue with us continuing along that path as we become more and more engaged with learning outcomes attached to modules that involve technologies that are emerging. So that's a path I think we're already on. And certainly I sit on a couple of quality assurance arts agencies at the European level. And when we go in and we review programs or institutions, we are seeing across the board a real engagement with both what I might call traditional artistic product or output and emerging technologies in a collaborative fashion emerging in some of these assessment practices, which is exciting to see. I think we'll just see more and more of that as we continue. For the standalone artistic institution, it may be easier to get there faster. When you have a larger institution that has multiple different disciplines, it may present, it may take a little bit longer, but we're already addressing that, I think. So that's exciting.
Thanks, Orla.
Yeah.
So next I'd like to go to Glenn Loughran, one of our colleagues on FAST45 and at TU Dublin. So Glenn has 3 questions in the chat, so I've asked him just maybe to ask one of them at the moment. And then if we have some time at the end, we can come back, but it's definitely worth reading them because they're all very good questions.
Thank you, Connor, and thank you, Stephen, for a great presentation. I suppose the questions altogether amount to an inquiry about the political economy of AI. More than being about education, but about how educators can position themselves within the political economy of AI. And I suppose the most important question to ask would be around the environmental impact of AI as we move towards generalized automation. Was there any research done alongside the OECD research on digital education? Was there any supplementary research done on the environmental impact of AI systems and how we might navigate those, because they're significant?
I'm not aware of that. There was something on blockchain, where initially at the beginning, people, the estimates of the blockchain footprint on sustainability was pretty big. This has been actually changed. So it was shown afterward that it's not as, energy consuming as what people initially imagined. For AI, I don't really know. So, however, I would say that, it's a question it's a social question rather than an education question. I wouldn't imagine that AI would be banned from education because of the sustainability effect when it would continue everywhere else, but that's really certainly something that has to be taken as part of the cost benefit analysis. There is a cost of that, and the cost is not just monetary, that there is and there will be, it will have to be taken into account, and the benefits are multifold as well, and we have to see whether they materialize or not. And at this stage, we don't really know, in fact, so I cannot show you much evidence that I can show you that it works, that it's being used. However, I cannot show you much evidence for many of those systems that actually they make a huge difference. And in fact, another thing that I could say, I've mentioned the question of the usefulness. Many of the things that those systems do, our teachers already know, so there is, if you have a dashboard and you know that your student is not going to do very well, so in some cases it just makes a little bit before. But if your student is not touching on any of the learning materials, for example, if you have a dashboard and it's all electronic, you can know immediately. If it is not, you will know the next quiz, that will be in 3 weeks. So perhaps you can intervene earlier, but it doesn't always bring you that much information, as a teacher. And so we have to think about what are the uses that do make a difference and that are really useful, and the ones where, in fact, that we don't necessarily need, even so it would be possible to do it.
Thank you.
And I'm just watching the clock here a little bit, so I think we unfortunately only have time for one more question. And the next question comes from John O'Connor.
Thanks, Connor. My question is actually a follow-on from, and it's linked to Glenn's question. So Glenn has talked about the environmental cost of this development. There's also obviously a financial cost. And my concern is really around that digital divide between the global north and the global south. And to be provocative, I would suggest that when researching this future of education, we actually have a responsibility to take account of that and ask questions about the cost of this and the implications for the future. And we particularly have a responsibility in the global north, which has benefited at the cost of the global south, not just to simply talk about the technology, but to actually build into this research from the very beginning, how this is going to affect that huge divide between our two societies. So my question really is, Do you agree with that?
I do, yeah.
And has it been done, I suppose?
I think that, well, I would say that, a lot of those technologies are also possibly beneficial for the global south, that they can help solve a lot of problems that they have. They have to provide sometimes more consistency in the quality of the education that people can access. At the same time, there is a big infrastructural problem right now, that if you don't have electricity, if you don't have broadband, then it's difficult. Even so, what we've seen during the COVID crisis is that there has been a lot of very smart users of the available technology, from that is available to people in all those countries. And you could imagine that the same can continue to happen. I think that there has been an adoption, the use of WhatsApp, of text, of, gatherings of radio, etc., that could actually continue, that it shouldn't, the idea that, people have just to necessarily go back to where it was, especially when everyone was telling how terrible the education was, it's not necessarily the best thing to do. And I hope that, this will be part of the kind of new ways of thinking about what education should look like, including there.
So unfortunately, we're going to have to, I think, draw the questions to a close now. We have still many more questions, and apologies to everyone in the chat who didn't get to ask their questions in person. I'd like to then thank our speakers once more for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us, to Stéphane Vincent-Lacroix from the OECD, and to Orla McDonough, our Dean here at TU Dublin. I would like to, just before we go, hold you a little bit more to tell you about some future activities of FAST45, and particularly of the learning platform that we're leading here with my colleagues Glenn Loughran and Kieran Corcoran, who are also on this call. So the first thing, part of this project is moving to the second phase of the learning platform. We've been listening to experts, listening to getting kind of the best, I guess, information, the best research into learning platforms and technology and education. And then we're going to start analyzing these insights and moving towards more conclusions and to understand these things more clearly. And the focus that we have decided is on actually this area of AI and creativity, because as we're seeing that there's systems emerging now, particularly in the visual arts, we've seen things like image synthesis systems like OpenAI's DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, incredibly sophisticated systems that are generating images and generating designs in ways that are almost human-like. Of course, it seems that they're being built on training on a lot of output, a lot of work of artists and designers. Much of this stuff has been trained without permissions and without crediting. So it's a very interesting developments that we're having, that we're seeing already in the visual arts, an area that perhaps we thought was immune from this. We're seeing displacement activities already starting to take place. So one of the things, and then the other question that we're looking at, and is a question that Orla has already raised, is this idea of, and it's an idea that AI has challenged us with, is what does it mean to be creative? What is an original output, or what is an original creative act? And AI is doing all sorts of interesting things that in current definitions of creativity would count as being quite creative and maybe human level equivalent. So these are the areas that we're going to look at. But also there's the area of how will this affect arts and humanities education in the future? How do we prepare? What kind of systems do we need to be investing in the future? And then the 1st and the 2nd of November, and this is the plug, we are hosting a future school, Art School Futures Lab. And this is we will be doing this in conjunction with our colleagues in Lucas School of Arts and Uni Arts in Helsinki. We'll be coming to Dublin to host this with stakeholders in the arts and humanities in Ireland. And we're looking at devising future scenarios that will predict I guess where these developments will take us. We'll gain insights about the future of art and technology in the art and design sector. We'll look for future opportunities and threats that may impact technological foresight in art and design, and discuss how to improve future conditions for research around this area of technological foresight in art and design. So not only are we thinking about what we need to do in the future, we're thinking about how better can we understand what the future might bring and how better to prepare for that. So this will be an in-person workshop on our campus in Grange Gorman on November 1st and November 2nd. And we are still taking some signups for that, for anyone who wants to attend. I think this will be all in person. Perhaps, Glenn, you could clarify this, or is there an opportunity for people to join us virtually? You're still muted, Glenn.
Sorry, I was trying to respond to Stephen in the chat box there, so you got me. You caught me on the chat system. What was the question?
The question was in the future art labs. Are these exclusively in person, or is there an opportunity for people to join us through Zoom or something similar?
No, they're not going to be hybrid.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
So I think this, I will, mindful again of the time, and thank everyone for their presence on a Friday morning, particularly at the end of the week, and it's also culture night here in Dublin. We're all planning to get out there and do activities. So I think if there's no more questions, I think, well, we have more questions. I think we can call it a day at this. And again, thank our speakers, thank the audience, thank you for your excellent questions. And just remind you that the recording will be available on the FAST45 website as part of the learning platform, along with the previous events in this series. And again, thank you all again. And on behalf of FAST45, the School of Art and Design, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at TU Dublin, I say goodbye and good luck.